He is. He's a little boy from the Midwest, very high moral standard, very private man, very shy, very, very shy.
Johnny Carson wasn't just the king of late night. Behind the glow of studio lights and the laughter of his audience, Carson's personal life housed hidden passions, discreet liaisons, and a carefully guarded world that few were ever privy to. In an era when the boundaries between public image and private reality were strictly enforced, and when the powerful machinery of Hollywood worked overtime to shield its stars, Carson's romantic entanglements remained buried for decades. Today, we'll delve into the stories of the amazing women who dated Johnny Carson in secret, and now we know the reason why. This is one story you can't miss. Let's start from the very beginning. The 1960s to 70s cultural landscape. Johnny Carson stepped into the national spotlight in 1962 when he took over The Tonight Show, just as America was on the cusp of profound transformation. The post-war boom had created a generation of Americans eager for entertainment, and television quickly became the heartbeat of the culture. By the end of the decade, it wasn't the movies or the radio that defined the collective imagination. It was the glowing box in the living room, with Carson's smooth baritone and sharp wit filling the airwaves. This was a time when television stars were household names, but the image they projected on screen was only part of the story. In public, they were expected to embody wholesomeness, success, and stability, traits that reassured viewers in a world grappling with the Cold War, civil rights struggles, and the escalating tensions of Vietnam. Carson, with his Midwestern charm and clean-cut style, was the perfect fit for this role. He was America's late-night friend, the man you could trust to make you laugh without offending your sensibilities. His jokes could be sly, but they were never crude. His demeanor was suave, but never suggestive. Yet, behind that polished exterior, Carson's private life was tangled in contradictions. Hollywood in the 1960s and 70s was built on an unspoken code of silence, a culture of mutual protection where scandals were managed, not exposed. Extramarital affairs, substance abuse, and personal failings were whispered about in industry circles but rarely made it into print. This discretion was a calculated business decision. Stars like Carson were brands, and the studios, sponsors, and networks that profited from them had no interest in tarnishing those brands. Tabloid journalism existed, of course, but it was not yet the relentless machine it would become by the 1980s and 90s. Photographers like Ron Galella might have lurked outside restaurants or trailed celebrities in New York and Los Angeles, but there was a line most reporters wouldn't cross. Editors knew when to bury a story. Publicists knew how to trade access for silence. Carson's own friend and fellow entertainer Frank Sinatra once said, "The press is like a pack of dogs. You throw them a bone, they'll leave you alone." And so the bones were thrown. Tips about lesser-known stars, stories that deflected attention, and carefully orchestrated narratives that kept the real scandals in the shadows. This culture of discretion was deeply tied to the male-dominated power structure of the entertainment industry. It was a boys' club in the truest sense, a closed world where powerful men like Carson, Sinatra, and Dean Martin could indulge in extramarital affairs, heavy drinking, and other vices without fear of public scrutiny. Women, in contrast, were expected to play along quietly, or risk being labeled troublemakers, or worse. Actresses like Angie Dickinson, who was rumored to have had an affair with Carson in the late 60s or early 70s, navigated this treacherous landscape with skill, understanding that discretion was the price of admission to the inner circles of fame. Dickinson herself once told a reporter, "Hollywood's an illusion. We all play a part, and sometimes the part you play in private is different from the one you play on the screen." While she never publicly confirmed her connection with Carson, the whispers were there, circulating at private parties in Bel Air, killed by waitstaff at exclusive restaurants like Chasen's or the Daisy on Rodeo Drive, where Carson was known to entertain. The tension between the public and private personas of stars was heightened by the broader cultural shifts of the era. This was the age of the sexual revolution, a time when the old rules of morality were being challenged by a generation eager to break free from the constraints of the 1950s. The publication of books like The Feminine Mystique in 1963, The Rise of the Counterculture, and the spread of birth control all contributed to a more open conversation about sex and relationships. Yet this openness was often selective. Stars like Carson, whose audience spanned Middle America, had to navigate the shifting sands carefully. They could hint at being with it enough to keep younger viewers engaged, but they couldn't risk alienating the older, more conservative viewers who tuned in religiously every night. So, while the country was changing, Carson's on-air persona remained safely apolitical, comfortably non-threatening, and steadfastly clean-cut. This balancing act was made easier by the relative absence of invasive paparazzi culture. Photographers might stake out hotspots like the Polo Lounge or the Troubadour, but they didn't yet have the technological tools or the editorial freedom to expose stars' private lives at the scale that would become common decades later. There was no TMZ, no 24/7 digital media cycle demanding fresh content. Stories that did break, like Elizabeth Taylor's affair with Richard Burton during the filming of Cleopatra in 1962, were the exception, not the rule. And they often broke because they were impossible to ignore. For someone like Carson, who cultivated a more private and controlled image, the machinery of discretion worked just as it was designed to, keeping his affairs and personal struggles out of the headlines. Even those closest to Carson tended to protect him, sometimes out of loyalty, sometimes out of fear. Ed McMahon, his longtime sidekick and friend, often described Carson as a complex figure, warm and generous one moment, distant and brooding the next. In his 2005 memoir, Here's Johnny, McMahon wrote, "Johnny was a private man. Even to those of us who knew him well, there were parts of his life he didn't share." It wasn't until much later, as the media landscape fractured and the old rules of celebrity began to crumble, that the full picture of Carson's personal life started to emerge. By then, the cultural landscape had changed. Today, we'll unveil the secret romantic life of Johnny Carson. Carson's 4 marriages. Johnny Carson's status as the undisputed king of late-night television came with an aura of power, charm, and influence that few could resist. Behind the curtain of The Tonight Show, Carson cultivated an image of a witty, all-American gentleman, but in the tight-knit world of Hollywood, he was known as a man with a restless appetite for women. Carson's known relationships, particularly his 4 marriages, including his stormy union with Joanna Holland from 1972 to 1985, barely scratched the surface of his romantic life. For context, his first marriage to Joan Jody Morrill Woolcott in 1949 was a classic post-war union that crumbled under the pressures of rising fame and his own evolving personality. By the time they divorced in 1963, Carson's career had catapulted him into the national spotlight, and his personal life had already begun to fracture in private ways that the public never fully grasped. Carson's second marriage, to model Joanne Copeland in 1963, coincided with the meteoric rise of The Tonight Show. Copeland was poised, elegant, and socially adept, a seemingly perfect match for Carson's new status as America's late-night king. Yet their union was fraught with difficulties. Carson's long working hours, his emotional distance, and whispers of his infidelities gnawed at their relationship, ultimately leading to a bitter divorce in 1972. The stormiest of all, however, was Carson's third marriage to Joanna Holland, a former model and socialite whom he married on September 30th, 1972, in Santa Monica. This relationship unfolded during the height of Carson's fame, when The Tonight Show was at its peak, pulling in tens of millions of viewers. Holland was seen as a poised, sophisticated woman who could hold her own in the elite circles Carson navigated. Yet their marriage was notoriously turbulent, marked by public spats, Carson's admitted infidelities, and a growing emotional chasm between them. The media reported on their lavish lifestyle, such as Carson's $5 million Malibu home and their high society gatherings, but the reality behind the scenes was far from glamorous. Holland famously filed for divorce on March 8, 1983, a move that caught even Carson off guard, leading to an acrimonious split, finalized in 1985, with Holland receiving a $20 million settlement. Years later, Holland reflected on her marriage, describing Carson as a man who could never truly be known. Carson's fourth and final marriage, to Alexis Moss in 1987, was strikingly different. Moss was a former stock brokerage employee, younger and less connected to the Hollywood scene, and their relationship, while lasting until Carson died in 2005, remained mostly out of the limelight. Some saw it as a quieter, more stable chapter in Carson's life, though by then, he had retreated from the public eye, his career behind him and much of the glitz stripped away. Yet these official unions only tell part of the story. The rumored affair with Angie Dickinson. By the late 1960s and early 70s, Angie Dickinson had carved out a reputation as one of Hollywood's most captivating leading ladies. Her breakthrough role as Feathers in Howard Hawks' Rio Bravo, opposite John Wayne, solidified her status as a sex symbol, but it was Policewoman, where she played the tough, street-smart Sergeant Pepper Anderson, that made her a household name. Dickinson wasn't just a pretty face. She was a symbol of the evolving role of women in media, a star who could project both sensuality and strength. It was in this atmosphere of rising fame and cultural flux that whispers began circulating about Dickinson's possible involvement with none other than Johnny Carson. Carson, by the early 1970s, was at the absolute peak of his stardom. The Tonight Show, starring Johnny Carson, regularly commanded over 15 million viewers a night, a staggering figure in any era. He was the undisputed king of late-night television, and his affable, polished image, charming yet reserved, witty but never too risque, made him a fixture in American living rooms. Yet behind that wholesome exterior was a man whose personal life was far more complicated. By the mid-70s, Carson had been married 3 times and was known within industry circles for his volatile temperament and his penchant for beautiful women. The alleged affair between Carson and Dickinson is one of those Hollywood stories that floated through the back rooms of Bel Air mansions, whispered among waitstaff at the Daisy or the Polo Lounge, but never fully made it to print. The timeline aligns tantalizingly. Dickinson's career was in high gear, thanks to Policewoman, which premiered in 1974, while Carson was navigating the end of his second marriage to Joanne Copeland, which dissolved in 1972, and the rocky early years of his third marriage to model Joanna Holland. Multiple sources, though often off the record, spoke of private parties at high-end locales like the Beverly Hills Hotel and intimate dinners at La Scala, where Carson and Dickinson were spotted laughing in dimly lit corners, their chemistry unmistakable to those in the know. For both stars, this alleged connection would have been as glamorous as it was risky. Dickinson was, by her own admission in later interviews, not a woman to be easily tied down. She once said, "I was never going to be a housewife in the traditional sense. I liked my independence." Carson, on the other hand, was notorious for his possessiveness and jealousy, as multiple accounts, including those from his son Chris and former sidekick Ed McMahon, would later reveal. For Carson, who carefully curated his public persona as the approachable, good-natured host, a public affair with someone like Dickinson could have threatened the delicate balance of his brand. It wasn't just about scandal, it was about control. Carson's show depended on maintaining a certain kind of universal appeal, one that might not have survived the whiff of impropriety that an exposed affair could bring. As a result, the two would allegedly arrive at parties separately and keep a respectful distance in public settings. Yet insiders, such as assistants, PR flacks, and a few trusted fellow entertainers, spoke of a lingering touch backstage at the Tonight Show tapings at NBC's Burbank studio, whispered conversations in dimly lit hallways, and shared smiles that spoke volumes. One studio technician who worked on the show in the early 1970s and later spoke anonymously recalled seeing Dickinson slip into Carson's dressing room more than once after tapings, always leaving quietly and without fanfare. "They had an understanding," he said. "It wasn't something they flaunted, but the chemistry was there. You could feel it in the air. Dickinson herself never outright confirmed the affair, but her later comments have done little to extinguish the rumors. In a 2003 interview with Larry King, when asked about Carson, Dickinson smiled coyly and replied, "Johnny was a wonderful man, very charming, very fun." She paused before saying "fun," and this pause was long enough to raise eyebrows. It was followed by her characteristic smirk. This only fueled further speculation. Similarly, in a 2007 Vanity Fair feature, Dickinson referred to her past relationships as "a few wonderful memories with some wonderful men," refusing to name names but leaving the door wide open for interpretation. Her careful choice of words, never denying, never confirming, was classic Hollywood strategy. Keep the mystique alive without offering the tabloids a definitive headline. For Carson, the allure of Dickinson wasn't hard to imagine. She embodied the kind of confident femininity that both captivated and unsettled the men of his generation. Intelligent, self-assured, and unapologetically in control of her own image. Yet the risk of exposure was real, and for a man who so jealously guarded his private life, any hint of impropriety could have threatened not just his marriage, but his entire empire. Carson's own reputation for being fiercely private is well documented. Ed McMahon once wrote, "Johnny had walls, big walls, and if you crossed them, you were out." That caution extended to his romantic life. Carson indulged his desires behind the scenes, but he did so with an understanding of the high stakes involved. What's perhaps most revealing is how this rumored affair has persisted in cultural memory, even decades later. In the 1970s, such a story, had it broken wide, would have been a career-threatening scandal for both Carson and Dickinson. The media landscape of the time, though shifting under the pressures of the sexual revolution and the rise of countercultural voices, still maintained a veneer of moral conservatism. But wait, Angie Dickinson wasn't the only one. Moving on, the brief fling with Marilyn Chambers. Marilyn Chambers was, in many ways, a lightning rod for the cultural contradictions of the early 1970s. A former mainstream model, famously known as the fresh-faced mother on ivory snow detergent boxes, 99 and 44/100% pure, as the tagline read, Chambers would soon explode onto the national scene in a way that no one, least of all the family-friendly advertising world, saw coming. When Behind the Green Door premiered in 1972, it was a cultural earthquake, a full-length, narrative-driven adult film featuring Chambers as the star. The shock wasn't just about the content, it was about her. The same woman who had cradled a baby on detergent boxes was now the face of a rising, albeit controversial, sexual revolution. Chambers, along with names like Linda Lovelace, became a symbol of the rapidly changing mores of the era, a flashpoint in the public debate over sexual liberation, pornography, and the boundaries of acceptable media. It was within this swirling, unpredictable landscape that rumors began to circulate about a brief, low-key connection between Marilyn Chambers and Johnny Carson. By the early 1970s, Carson had cemented himself as the undisputed monarch of late-night television. The duo's fling is said to have occurred sometime between 1972 and 1974, a period when Chambers' fame was skyrocketing and Carson was navigating the collapse of his second marriage to Joanne Copeland. It was a brief, almost whispered chapter, one that, for obvious reasons, never made it to the pages of Variety or The Hollywood Reporter. According to a former Tonight Show staffer who spoke anonymously in a 1990s interview for a retrospective on Carson's life, Chambers and Carson had a few casual private meetings. Nothing serious, just drinks, conversation, a little fun. The source added, Carson knew it couldn't go anywhere. Marilyn was a hot story, and Johnny couldn't risk the headlines. It was just a moment. Indeed, the stakes for Carson were incredibly high. Chambers, despite the allure she held for many men in Hollywood, was radioactive in the eyes of mainstream media. The adult film industry, though increasingly prominent in the early 1970s thanks to films like Deep Throat and Behind the Green Door, was still seen as a seedy, taboo-laden world. starkly at odds with the wholesome middle American values that Carson's persona represented. Chambers herself, in her later years, spoke candidly about the men who crossed her path during that whirlwind time, though she never named Carson directly. In a 2003 interview with High Society magazine, she reflected on the paradox of her fame. "I was the girl next door, but I was also the girl they didn't want to talk about at dinner parties." She hinted at some high-profile men who had reached out to her in those years, adding, "They wanted the fantasy, but they didn't want the world to know." Her words could just as easily have described Carson's attitude, fascinated by the raw, uninhibited energy Chambers embodied, but unwilling to let that world bleed into his carefully controlled public image. The cultural climate of the time made such a fling both thrilling and dangerous. The sexual revolution was in full swing. Behind the Green Door itself was part of the so-called porno chic movement, where films like it were reviewed in the New York Times and discussed in mainstream media. Yet, despite this surface-level acceptance, adult film stars were still viewed as disreputable figures, objects of both fascination and scorn. As a result, the duo's meetings took place in private, such as Carson's dressing room after tapings, secluded corners of industry parties, and the occasional invitation-only gathering in the Hollywood Hills where the music was loud, the drinks were flowing, and the press was nowhere in sight. There were no public dinners at Chasen's, no shared appearances at events like the Golden Globes or the Oscars. It was, as one Tonight Show insider put it, a bubble, an intersection of two very different worlds, never meant to be anything more. But this was not all. Secret Affair with Morgan Fairchild. Morgan Fairchild was a blonde bombshell with a striking presence, known for her early work on the soap opera Search for Tomorrow, where she portrayed the scheming Jennifer Pace, and later for her iconic role as the icy Jenna Wade on Dallas. At the time, she embodied the archetype of the glamorous, up-and-coming Hollywood starlet, aspirational, elegant, and with a certain calculated ambition that helped her navigate the complex social networks of the entertainment industry. Her ascent coincided with Carson's reign as the undisputed king of late-night television. As Fairchild began making more appearances on the show and attending A-list events where Carson often held court, whispers began to swirl in industry circles about a possible connection between the two. These gatherings, whether at the Beverly Hills Hotel's Polo Lounge, at Carson's private gatherings in Malibu, or at industry events like the Television Academy Galas, were the social hubs where power players mingled, flirted, and occasionally formed private liaisons. Those who were close to Carson at the time would later suggest that the chemistry between Carson and Fairchild was palpable. One staffer from The Tonight Show, who worked on the production floor in the mid-1970s, recalled seeing Fairchild backstage more than once, noting how Carson's demeanor would shift when she was in the room. He'd get this twinkle in his eye, a little more attentive than usual. It wasn't just business, it was something else. Another Tonight Show guest during that era, comedian David Brenner, once joked, off-mic in private company, that Carson had a soft spot for the glamorous blondes who could hold their own at the table. Fairchild herself has never publicly addressed these rumors in detail, but she has, in various interviews over the years, acknowledged how navigating Hollywood's male-dominated culture often meant cultivating strategic relationships and playing a part in the unspoken social games that came with it. In a 1995 interview with People, Fairchild spoke vaguely about the challenges of being a young actress in the 70s. She said, "It was a man's world. You learned how to handle attention, how to deflect what you didn't want, and how to stay in the game." For Carson, a connection with Fairchild, whether brief or simply a flirtation, would have fit a pattern of his life at the time. He was married to Joanna Holland during the 1970s, but their relationship was notoriously strained. Carson was known for his charm and his appeal to beautiful, ambitious women, and his position at the epicenter of television made him an attractive, if potentially risky, figure. Fairchild, ambitious and aware of the value of proximity to power, might have found the attention from Carson flattering. even if it remained discreet and ultimately transient. The unspoken rules of the era allowed such liaisons to flourish without public scrutiny. Paparazzi culture was not yet the relentless force it would become in later decades. Studio fixers and publicists often worked behind the scenes to ensure that stars like Carson remained untarnished in the press. Gossip columnists, Hedda Hopper and Luella Parsons earlier, and later Rona Barrett, might have heard whispers, but such stories were often filtered, massaged, or outright suppressed, especially when the figure in question was someone as powerful as Carson. Moreover, Carson had a reputation for keeping his private life tightly controlled, even among his closest confidants. As one Tonight Show producer put it, Johnny knew how to keep a secret. He could charm you into thinking you knew him, but the truth is, you didn't. Not really. Fairchild's career continued to ascend throughout the 70s and 80s, and while her path occasionally crossed with Carson's, both seemed to maintain a careful, professional distance in public. Yet those who were part of the industry's inner circles continued to whisper quietly at dinner parties or over drinks at the Beverly Wilshire about that brief period in the mid-70s when Carson and Fairchild seemed to share a connection that was more than just professional. A brief dalliance with Adrienne LaRussa. Adrienne LaRussa's name may not resonate today with the same cultural weight as other stars of the era, but in the early 1970s, she was a familiar face to viewers of television dramas and soap operas. Born in 1948 in New York City, LaRussa began her acting career with small roles in TV shows like The Doctors and Bonanza, as well as a few minor film appearances. Her striking features, high cheekbones, expressive eyes, and a certain understated allure made her a frequent guest at Hollywood events, where she mingled with producers, directors, and rising stars alike. It was in this bustling, often insular world that she crossed paths with Johnny Carson. The encounter, as some insiders later whispered, likely happened in 1973 at a private industry gathering at the Beverly Hills Hotel, Carson's favored refuge after taping The Tonight Show. These parties were quieter, more exclusive, and often served as the real engines of Hollywood's social machinery. Carson, already deep into his third marriage with Joanna Holland, had a reputation for charm and discretion at these events. According to an anonymous Tonight Show staffer who spoke to a biographer years later, Adrienne was seen coming and going at odd hours, sometimes late at night, sometimes early in the morning. This same source hinted that LaRussa was always careful not to be seen leaving directly with Johnny, but people noticed. LaRussa herself, of course, has never publicly commented on the rumored connection, and no concrete photographs, correspondence, or confirmed accounts have ever surfaced to solidify the speculation. Yet the whispers persisted, in part because of the recurring patterns in Carson's private life. While The Tonight Show remained a gleaming symbol of his professional success, Carson's personal relationships were often more chaotic and hidden. His marriage to Joanna Holland, which lasted from 1972 to 1985, was marred by long stretches of emotional distance, punctuated by Carson's notorious temper and his wandering eye. The contrast between his warm, affable on-screen persona and the cool, often guarded man behind the scenes was striking. As Ed McMahon, Carson's longtime sidekick, famously said in a 1992 interview, "Johnny was the best in front of the camera, but you never really got to know the man behind the scenes. He could be warm one minute and cold as ice the next." The toxic power dynamics of Carson's relationships. One striking pattern in Carson's relationships, both rumored and confirmed, was the uneven power dynamic. Carson held all the cards. He was the gatekeeper of late-night success, the man who could make or break careers with a single booking. For young women in Hollywood, an association with Carson was both an opportunity and a risk. Yet Carson seemed to prefer those who were not yet stars in their own right. Women who wouldn't challenge his authority, who would remain discreet, and who, if things turned sour, wouldn't have the platform to expose him. There were whispers of brief dalliances with lesser-known actresses like Elaine Joyce and Susan Anton, both of whom had the blend of beauty and ambition that seemed to draw Carson in. Joyce, known for her appearances on game shows like Match Game and sitcoms in the early 70s, was seen by some insiders as a favorite of Carson's for a brief time. Anton, who gained fame in the mid-70s for her roles in films and as a model, was rumored to have had at least a flirtatious connection with Carson during her early rise. The culture of the time also worked in Carson's favor. The entertainment industry was, by and large, a boys' club, where powerful men protected each other's reputations and indiscretions. There was an unspoken understanding. What happened at industry parties or behind closed doors stayed there, unreported and unchallenged. Women who might have spoken out risked not only their own reputations, but also their chances of finding work in an industry where men like Carson controlled the gates. Carson's romantic life also reflected his broader personal struggles. His marriages were notoriously volatile. Joanne Copeland, his second wife, endured years of neglect and alleged emotional abuse before their divorce in 1972. His third marriage, to Joanna Holland, began that same year. And although it appeared stable on the surface, insiders described Carson as distant and prone to sudden outbursts. Carson's friend, the comedian Dick Cavett, once remarked in an off-the-record conversation that Johnny could charm an audience of millions but struggled to sit in a room with someone one-on-one. He was complicated, a man who wanted love but didn't know how to give it back. Carson, with his immense power as America's late-night king, was shielded by this machinery, while his own careful control over his private life and mercurial temperament ensured that even those closest to him didn't dare speak out. This culture of silence, combined with a conservative public morality and a lack of invasive paparazzi, allowed him to maintain a pristine image as a charming, wholesome host, even as he quietly navigated a complex personal life behind the scenes. It wasn't until after he died in 2005, amid a more aggressive media climate that thrived on exposés, that many of these stories began to surface, shedding light on the hidden contradictions of one of television's most iconic figures. Well, that's it for now. Thanks for watching. Did you like this video? If you did, please consider liking, dropping a comment, and hitting the subscribe button so that you don't miss out on our new uploads. Also, don't miss this video you see on your screen right now. It's truly unbelievable.